We usually picture Abraham from the very beginning as a wanderer, a man with sheep and canvas tents, walking along the dusty edges of the ancient Middle East. We imagine his story starting in a quiet wilderness, far away from the noise of civilization. We assume his life was always simple, always nomadic, and always isolated. But before the tents, before the desert, and long before the promise, Abraham lived in the exact opposite of a wilderness. That sounds like a small geographical detail. It is not. It actually changes everything about what it meant for him to first hear the voice of God. When we read the end of Genesis chapter 11, we are introduced to a man named Abram, before his name is changed to Abraham. The text is transitioning from the grand, global events of the Tower of Babel down to the specific lineage of one family. And as the narrative zooms in, it gives us a very specific location for his early life. Verse 28 tells us that Abram's brother Harran died in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. For most modern readers, Ur is just a hard-to-pronounce name. It is a tiny black dot on one of those faded maps at the back of a printed Bible. We read past it quickly. We treat it like a blank starting line, assuming it was just a primitive, forgotten village somewhere in the ancient world. We tend to read biblical geography as if it is just background trivia, believing that the locations do not matter as much as the theology. But in Scripture, geography is almost always theological. Where a person is called from is often just as important as where they are called to. To the people living in the ancient Near East, Ur was not a blank space. It was the center of the world. When God eventually tells Abram to leave his country, his people, and his father's household, he is not asking a wandering shepherd to move his flock to another patch of dirt. He is asking a citizen of an ancient superpower to walk away from the safest, wealthiest, and most culturally dominant city on earth. Abram was not a desert nomad who stumbled into a promise. He was an urbanite. He lived in a society defined by towering architecture, complex mathematics, written legal codes, and massive economic trade. He was surrounded by thick, protective walls. He was insulated by wealth and a highly structured society. By every human metric, he had every reason to stay exactly where he was. When we realize this, the entire beginning of the biblical story shifts. Abram's call is no longer just a story about a physical relocation. It becomes a story about a radical abandonment of human security. It is about leaving behind the ultimate symbol of human achievement for the sake of an unseen God. The magnitude of his faith is almost impossible to measure until we understand exactly what he was being asked to leave. Because Ur was not just a city, it was an empire. To understand the weight of God's command to simply go, we first have to look at what Abram was turning his back on. We have to reconstruct the world he knew. And to understand what makes his exit so profound, we must look at what this sprawling, seemingly indestructible metropolis actually worshipped. When archaeologists first began heavily excavating the ruins of Ur in the 1920s and 30s, they expected to find the remains of a typical, primitive, ancient settlement. They were digging in the sands of modern-day Iraq, near the Persian Gulf, looking for the historical backdrop of the early chapters of Genesis. What they uncovered instead completely reshaped how historians view the ancient world. They did not find a dusty, forgotten village of wandering herdsmen. They uncovered a sprawling, highly advanced metropolis. During the era when Abram would have lived, the city of Ur was effectively the New York or London of the ancient Near East. It was a massive port city, connected by a network of canals to the Euphrates River, serving as a global hub for international trade. Merchant ships brought gold, silver, copper, ivory, and precious stones from across the known world directly to its docks. The people of Ur lived in large, two-story houses made of carefully fired brick. These homes featured interior courtyards, staircases, whitewashed walls, and surprisingly sophisticated drainage and plumbing systems. This was not a society of simple survival. It was a society of scribes, mathematicians, architects, and astronomers. They had formal educational systems. They developed complex legal codes, mapped the constellations, and recorded thousands of commercial transactions on heavy clay tablets. They engineered massive agricultural irrigation networks that turned the harsh desert environment into a reliable, endless breadbasket. If you lived in Ur, you were not scraping by in the margins of history. You were living at the absolute peak of human achievement. Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, tells us that Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans. We often read that detail as a simple, ancient relocation. We imagine them casually packing up their belongings and walking toward a new horizon. But to leave Ur was not just a change of scenery. It meant abandoning the ultimate human safety net. In the ancient world, your city was your life. The city walls were the only thing separating civilization from chaos. Inside those walls, there was a predictable food supply, a thriving economy, and a standing military to protect you from invasion. Outside the walls was the wilderness. Outside was exposure to violent nomadic raiders, sudden and unpredictable famines, and the unforgiving elements of the desert. To leave the city was to voluntarily make yourself entirely vulnerable. It meant stepping away from a massive, engineered system designed to guarantee your survival, and stepping into a space where survival was never promised. Abram was not escaping a collapsing, failing society. He was walking away from the most successful and secure society on earth. He was trading the strongest brick foundations in the ancient world for a fragile life in canvas tents. And that raises a deeply profound question. Why would a family leave the cultural and economic center of the known world? Why would a man walk away from such immense, tangible security? The answer is found not in what Ur possessed, but in what it demanded of its citizens. Because the towering brick walls and the advanced mathematics of this city were not just signs of human progress. They were not spiritually neutral. The wealth of the city was intimately tied to a massive structure that dominated the skyline. The architecture and the economy were monuments to a very specific and very demanding spiritual allegiance. If you stood in the streets of Ur during Abram's lifetime, your eyes would immediately be drawn upward. The skyline was not dominated by palaces for kings, but by a massive, terraced pyramid made of baked mud brick. This was the Great Ziggurat of Ur. It was a towering, artificial mountain built on the flat plains of Mesopotamia. And it was not just a monument, it was a throne room for a very specific deity. Ur was the absolute center for the worship of Nana, the ancient god of the moon. In the ancient Near East, the moon was seen as a supreme cosmic force. It ruled the dangerous night sky. It governed the calendar. It dictated the agricultural cycles. To the people of Ur, the moon god was the source of their immense prosperity, the guarantor of their safety, and the ultimate authority over their empire. But the temple of the moon god was not just a place where people went to offer occasional prayers. In ancient Sumerian culture, religion and economics were entirely merged. The temple was the central bank. It was the granary. It was the administrative heart of the government. The priests of Nana controlled the land, managed the massive agricultural output, and distributed the wealth of the city. To be a citizen of Ur was to be entirely dependent on the religious system of the moon god. You could not separate your daily survival from the idolatry of the empire. You could not buy, sell, or trade without participating in the system that kept the ziggurat standing. And this is where the biblical narrative delivers a quiet but massive shock. Because we naturally assume that Abram was different. We assume that even though he lived in a deeply pagan city, he must have been a secret monotheist. We imagine him as a lone, righteous man holding out against a corrupt culture, keeping his hands clean, and waiting patiently for the true God to speak. We like to think God chose Abram because Abram already possessed a pure, uncorrupted theology. But the biblical text tells a completely different story. Centuries later, when the leader Joshua is giving his final address to the nation of Israel, he forces them to look back at their origins. In Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, he says this, "Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods." That is a staggering detail. It means Abram did not come from a long line of faithful, wilderness believers. He came from a family of idolaters. His father, Terah, worshipped the gods of the empire. Abram was raised in the shadow of the ziggurat. He grew up in a household that bowed to the moon god. His family's wealth, their safety, and their social standing were deeply woven into the pagan fabric of Ur. Abram was not called because he was already holy. He was called out of profound spiritual darkness. The call of God was not a reward for his perfect faith. It was an unmerited, sudden intrusion of grace into a deeply compromised life. God reached into the very heart of the world's most advanced pagan empire, bypassed the towering temples, and spoke to a man who was surrounded by statues of stone and wood. And he asked that man to do the unthinkable. to walk away from the moon god, to walk away from the temple economy, to sever ties with the only spiritual and physical security his family had ever known, which makes the event that happened next not just surprising, but completely without precedent in the ancient world. How does a man deeply entrenched in a culture of idolatry suddenly walk away from it? He does not just wake up one day and decide to invent monotheism. The biblical text makes it clear that Abram was not quietly searching for a new religion. He was not looking for God. God interrupted Abram. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts chapter 7, a man named Stephen is standing before the religious leaders of Israel, giving a massive summary of their history. And in verse 2, he begins the story of their faith with this specific moment. He says, "The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Harran." Consider the profound contrast of that scene. In the city of Ur, a god was something you could see. A god was carved from wood, overlaid with gold and silver, and seated in a dark, heavily guarded room at the top of a mud brick pyramid. The moon god, Nana, had to be washed, clothed, and fed daily by a highly organized rotation of priests. The gods of Sumer were entirely bound to their physical locations. If you left the city walls, you left the jurisdiction and the protection of the god. Furthermore, in the ancient Near East, gods did not casually speak to ordinary citizens. If you wanted to know the will of the divine, you had to consult the temple. You had to pay for a ritual. You had to wait for highly trained experts to read the movements of the stars, interpret your dreams, or examine the organs of a sacrificed sheep. Communication with the gods was a controlled, bureaucratic, and highly expensive process. But the God who suddenly breaks into Abram's life is completely different. He bypasses the entire religious economy of the empire. He does not require a priest. He does not send an omen in the night sky. He has no physical statue. He has no earthly shrine. He requires no human hands to feed him or carry him. He is invisible, uncontainable, and entirely unbound by the geography of the ziggurat. Stephen calls him the God of glory. In a metropolis obsessed with the visible glory of human architecture and the dazzling display of wealthy temples, the true God reveals a different kind of glory. A glory with so much weight, so much undeniable reality, that it instantly shatters the illusion of the idols Abram had grown up worshiping. And this uncreated, invisible God speaks a direct, personal, and commanding word. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, God says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household, to the land I will show you." Notice the terrifying vulnerability in that command. God does not give Abram a map. He does not give him an exact destination. He does not promise that the new land will have better walls, better irrigation, or a stronger economy than the city he is leaving. The idols of Ur offered immediate, visible, and tangible security. Yahweh offers nothing but his spoken word. Abram is being asked to trade the ultimate visual religion for a journey based entirely on an invisible promise. Pause for a second and see what has emerged in the story. We are no longer looking at a simple historical account of an ancient nomadic migration. We are watching a profound spiritual collision. The wealthiest pagan empire of the ancient world is being confronted by the sudden voice of the living God. And that voice is calling one man to walk away from it all. But as we look closer at the text in Genesis, we notice a tiny detail that complicates the picture. There is a specific phrase attached to the city's name. A phrase that seems like a simple geographic marker. But it actually creates a centuries-long historical puzzle that scholars have debated for generations. 4 words in Genesis chapter 11 have caused centuries of debate among historians. Ur of the Chaldeans. It sounds like a simple ancient address, but there is a historical puzzle hidden inside that phrase. During the era when Abram actually lived, the Chaldeans did not control that region. The Chaldean people did not become a dominant political and military power in southern Mesopotamia until many centuries later. They are most famous for eventually establishing the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the terrifying empire of King Nebuchadnezzar. So, if the Chaldeans were not there when Abram was alive, why does the book of Genesis call it their city? For a long time, critics of the Bible pointed to this phrase as a historical mistake. They argued that the writer of Genesis simply did not know his history, placing a later empire into an earlier timeline. But careful biblical scholars see something entirely different happening in the text. It is not an error. It is a geographic translation. When the earliest biblical texts were being compiled, copied, and preserved for later generations of Israelites, the scribes and prophets would occasionally update a place name. They did this so the people reading the text in their current century would actually know where the story happened. We do the same thing today without even thinking about it. If a historian says, Julius Caesar invaded France, we know exactly what they mean. France did not exist during the Roman Empire. The region was called Gaul, but if the historian uses the word France, the modern reader immediately understands the geography. The biblical writers did the same thing. When they wrote Ur of the Chaldeans, they were pointing back to Abram's ancient Sumerian city, but they were using a name their current audience would immediately recognize. But this is not just a lesson in ancient geography. It has a massive theological purpose. Because to the ancient Israelites reading the book of Genesis, the word Chaldean meant something very specific and very terrifying. It meant Babylon. Later in biblical history, the Chaldeans would march into Jerusalem, destroy the temple of God, and drag the Israelites back to Babylon as exiles. So when the biblical writer deliberately calls Abram's home Ur of the Chaldeans, he is making a profound theological connection for the people of Israel. He is telling them that their founding father, the man who started their entire story of faith, was called out of the very same empire where they would later be enslaved. Abram's journey began by leaving Babylon. The message to the ancient Israelites was incredibly hopeful. If God could call your father Abram out of the ultimate pagan empire, he can sustain you when you are trapped in it, and he can call you out of it again. The geography is not a mistake. It is a theological anchor. It establishes from the very first pages of the biblical story that the life of faith always involves an exit from the empire. It always requires leaving the systems of human pride, idolatry, and self-reliance that Babylon represents. Ur of the Chaldeans is not just a dot on a map. It is a symbol of the world system that every believer is eventually called to abandon. God drew a line in the sand of Mesopotamia. He pointed to the most powerful, intimidating, and secure society on earth and told one family to walk away. But knowing exactly where this city was and what it represented only highlights a quiet tragedy hidden in the same chapter. Because Abram was not actually the first man in his family to pack his belongings and walk out of the city gates, the journey did not actually begin with him. It began with his father. And his father's journey stands as a permanent warning about the danger of halfway obedience. Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, contains one of the most tragic half-sentences in the biblical narrative. It says that Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his grandson Lot, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. Notice that destination. They were heading for Canaan, the exact same place God would eventually tell Abram to go. But the verse does not end there. It continues by saying, "But when they came to Harran, they settled there." Terah started the journey. He packed his household. He walked out of the massive gates of Ur. He left the wealth and the security of the empire behind. But he never made it to the promised land. He stopped halfway. To understand why this is so significant, we have to look at the geography and history of the city where Terah decided to stop. Harran was located far to the northwest of Ur, sitting on a major trade route. For a long time, readers assumed that Terah simply got tired. We assume he was too old to finish the long journey to Canaan, so he just picked a convenient town along the way and decided to live out his final years in peace. But ancient history reveals a much deeper and much more spiritually devastating reason for why Terah stopped in Harran. In the ancient Near East, there were two major, dominant centers for the worship of the moon god. The first was Ur. The second was Harran. When Terah left his homeland, he traveled hundreds of miles, only to settle in a city that worshipped the exact same idol he had supposedly left behind. He traded one moon-worshipping metropolis for another. He changed his geography, but he did not change his theology. He left the physical borders of Ur, but he could not bring himself to leave the spiritual system that had defined his entire life. When Terah saw the familiar temples of Harran, when he recognized the familiar economic structure of the priests, when he felt the familiar security of his old gods, he stopped. The pull of the familiar was too strong. He settled there. And the very next verse, Genesis chapter 11, verse 32, delivers the quiet, tragic conclusion to his life. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Harran. He died in the place of compromise. He died in the halfway city. He started a journey toward the land of promise, but he was unwilling to fully sever his ties to the empire of his past. This detail completely reshapes how we understand the beginning of Abram's actual calling. Because when God speaks to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, Abram is not living in Ur anymore. He is living in Harran. He is living in the shadow of his father's failure. He is surrounded by the exact same idolatry his family had just traveled hundreds of miles to escape. And this is where we begin to see the immense weight of what God is actually asking Abram to do. God is not just telling him to finish a road trip. He is telling him to break a generational cycle. He is telling him to do what his father, Terah, did not have the spiritual courage to do. Terah's journey ended in compromise, which meant if Abram was going to inherit the promise, he had to make a cut that went much deeper than geography. He had to strike at the three foundational pillars of ancient human security. When God finally speaks the foundational command of the biblical story to Abram, he does not just say, "Leave." In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, God is highly specific. He says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." To a modern reader, those three phrases might sound like poetic repetition. They sound like God is just saying the same thing three different ways. But in the ancient Near East, this was not poetry. This was a systematic dismantling of a man's entire identity. God was targeting the three concentric circles of human security, stripping them away one by one. The first circle was his country. This was his geographic and political security. To leave his country meant walking away from the empire of Ur and the familiar outpost of Harran. It meant leaving behind the advanced irrigation systems, the walled protection against invaders, and the thriving agricultural economy. It was the voluntary forfeiture of citizenship in the most advanced civilization on Earth. The second circle was his people. This was his social and tribal security. In the ancient world, there was no such thing as an independent, self-made individual. Your survival depended entirely on your extended clan. If you were attacked, your people defended you. If you faced famine, your people shared their grain. To step outside of your tribal network was to become an alien, a foreigner without any legal or physical protection. But the third circle was the most devastating. God told him to leave his father's household. This was his financial and spiritual security. Abram was the son of Terah. In a patriarchal society, the father's household held the inheritance. It held the family wealth, the livestock, and the deep generational ties. And as we saw in the book of Joshua, the father's household was also the center of their spiritual life. It was where the household idols were kept. By telling Abram to leave his father's household, God was demanding a total severing of ties. Abram could not take the gods of his father with him. He could not rely on the wealth of his father to fund the journey. He was not being sent out as a wealthy colonist to claim new land for his family. He was being asked to die to his old life so that God could resurrect him into a new one. Notice the staggering asymmetry of this exchange. God asks Abram to give up his country, his people, and his family. And what does God offer in return? He does not offer a blueprint. He does not offer a signed deed to a better city. He simply says, "To the land I will show you." He offers a bare promise. The idols of Ur offered massive, visible, brick-and-mortar security. Yahweh demanded that Abram trade all of that for nothing but the invisible integrity of his word. Faith, in its earliest biblical definition, is not just believing that God exists. Faith is the willingness to walk away from the empire's security, trusting that God's voice is stronger than the city's walls. Terah had tried to make this journey, but he could not bring himself to cut the final ties. He stopped in Harran because the cost of leaving the familiar was too high. But Abram did it. He made the cut. He packed his tents, gathered his immediate household, and walked away from the greatest civilization of the ancient world. He stepped out of the empire and into the wilderness. But centuries later, the New Testament writer of Hebrews points out a final, quiet detail about this departure. And that detail changes how we see the rest of Abraham's entire life. When Abram walked out of the massive gates of Ur, he did not just change his location, he changed his architecture. Centuries later, the New Testament writer of Hebrews looks back at this exact moment in biblical history. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, the writer gives us a profound summary of the journey. He says, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Notice the specific architectural detail the writer chooses to highlight. He lived in tents. To a modern reader, that might just sound like standard ancient living. We tend to assume everyone lived in tents back then. But remember exactly where Abram came from. He came from Ur. He came from a sprawling metropolis built of baked mud brick. He came from a society of two-story houses, paved interior courtyards, and massive, towering ziggurats. Ur was a city obsessed with permanence. It was defined by heavy, immovable, human-made foundations. To live in a tent was the absolute reversal of everything Abram had been taught about success, wealth, and security. A tent has no foundation. It is fragile. It is entirely vulnerable to the wind, the rain, and the violent elements of the wilderness. It can be taken down and moved in a matter of minutes. When Abram chose to live in a tent, he was making a massive theological statement. He was declaring that he was no longer trusting in the engineering of human empires to protect him. But the writer of Hebrews does not stop there. In verse 10, he explains exactly why Abram was willing to trade the strong bricks of Ur for the fragile canvas of a tent. He writes, "For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." Look at the brilliant contrast happening in that single sentence. Ur had foundations, but they were built by men. They were monuments to the moon god. They were built by the exact same human pride that constructed the Tower of Babel just a few chapters earlier in Genesis. Abram had lived his entire life surrounded by the greatest, thickest foundations human hands could build. But when he heard the voice of the living God, his vision shifted. He suddenly realized that the most secure, well-defended city on earth was actually incredibly fragile because it was built on idolatry and rebellion. The bricks of Babylon could not ultimately save him. So he walked away from the false foundations of the empire, and he chose to live as a stranger. He embraced the vulnerability of the tent because he was waiting for a city that could never be destroyed, a city whose builder is God. The biblical text does not say Abram was just enduring the tents until he could build his own personal brick fortress in Canaan. The tent was not an accident. It was the intentional posture of his faith. It was the physical expression of a man who finally realized that the world system was no longer his true home. He was walking through the ancient world, but he was no longer anchored to it. He had become a pilgrim. And this is where the geography of Ur stops being just a piece of ancient history. It ceases to be just a forgotten name in the book of Genesis, and it becomes a blueprint for the life of every believer. When we look back across the vast distance of centuries, the ancient ruins of Ur can seem entirely disconnected from our modern reality. We see the broken mud brick walls, the excavated houses, and the silent, weathered remains of the great ziggurat standing empty in the desert of modern-day Iraq. It feels like a story from another world. But the geography of Genesis is never just about dirt and stone. It is about the human condition. Ur of the Chaldeans is not just a historical city where Abraham spent his youth. It is a spiritual archetype. It represents the starting point for every single person who is ever called into a relationship with the living God. Ur is the world system. It is the place of manufactured security, of human pride, and of comfortable idolatry. It is the environment where we are taught to trust in what we can build, what we can see, and what we can control. We all have an Ur. For some, it is the security of a predictable career path or a stable financial bank account. For others, it is the comfort of cultural expectations, the safety of staying within the tribal boundaries of our family's approval, or the quiet reliance on our own intelligence and planning. These things are not inherently evil, just as the advanced mathematics and architecture of ancient Sumer were not evil in themselves. But they are spiritually dangerous because they constantly invite us to sit down in the shadow of our own ziggurats. They tempt us to look at our walls and believe that we are completely safe without God. And that is why the journey of faith always, without exception, begins with an exit. You cannot receive the promise of the future while clinging desperately to the false security of the past. You cannot experience the life of the kingdom while remaining entirely dependent on the systems of the empire. This theme does not end with Abraham in the book of Genesis. It echoes through the entire biblical narrative, winding its way through the centuries until it reaches the very last pages of Scripture. In the book of Revelation, chapter 18, verse 4, the Apostle John hears a loud voice crying out from heaven regarding the final, global manifestation of human empire. The voice says, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues." The call to leave Babylon is the exact same call that was given to Abraham in the streets of Ur. It is a command to step out of the crowd, to break the generational patterns of compromise, and to trust in a voice that cannot be seen. Terah tried to leave, but he allowed the comforts of a halfway city to steal his destiny. He died in Harran because he preferred a familiar idol over an unfamiliar wilderness. But Abraham chose the tent. He traded the permanent bricks of a pagan superpower for a fragile life of wandering because his eyes had been opened to a greater reality. He realized that the only truly secure place in the universe is not inside a walled city, but inside a covenant with the creator of the world. If you are listening to this today, perhaps you are standing at your own crossroads. Perhaps you can hear the quiet, persistent voice of God calling you to step away from something that feels safe, something familiar, or something that your culture tells you is absolutely necessary for your survival. It can be terrifying to walk away from the foundations you have spent your whole life building. It can feel like stepping into a void. But the story of Abraham reminds us that when God asks you to leave your country, your people, and your father's household, He never leaves you empty-handed. He replaces your human security with His divine presence. He replaces your temporary brick houses with an eternal kingdom. If this deep dive into the geography of faith has helped you see the scriptures with fresh eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you can join us for our next biblical discovery. The journey of faith is long, and it requires us to keep walking. But remember that the path to the promised land always begins with a single, courageous step out of the gates of the empire. The map was never just a map. The story of Ur was always a portrait of grace, reaching into the darkness to pull a pilgrim home.